and safety rely on system values that include following values. Radiometric quantities used to characterize source and fields of ionized radiation, and dosimetric quantities used for the purposes of radiation protection and safety, and serving to characterize the effects of radiation on humans, which in turn are divided into two large groups. Basic dosimetric radiometric quantities and basic dosimetric quantities are discussed earlier in lecture 2, and accurate dosimetric quantities will be discussed here. Accurate dosimetric quantities serve as a measure of the effect of radiation on a person if exposed. Accurate dosimetric quantities are derived from basic dosimetric quantities, determined for direct use in radiogenic risk assessments, and serve as characteristics of the conditions of human exposure to radiation. Since the universal theory of the biological effect of radiation has not been created, various accurate quantities are used in particular models for the development of deterministic and stochastic effects of radiation. The development of radiation effects is not fully understood and understandable. Therefore, the system of accurate values is constantly being modified following the change in our knowledge about the laws of the biological effects of radiation and ideas about how best to ensure human safety when handling with sources. So the system will consider So this section will consider radiation risk as a probability of development of biological effects of radiation, the concept of radiation and dose, absorbed dose in the organ, the concept of standard person, and radiation quality.
Recording in progress.
For the purpose of radiation protection and safety, the so-called heavy effects of radiation are considered. The development of which can lead to premature death or a significant reduction in the period of normal life. These effects fall into two categories: deterministic radiation effects, for which the relationship between the radiation dose and the development of the effect is more or less unambiguous or deterministic, and stochastic effects of radiation, for which such a relationship is probabilistic or stochastic in nature. This category of stochastic effects includes cancer and inherited diseases like genetic effects. The radiation causes an increase in the likelihood of such diseases that spontaneously occur without any exposure and are observed with varying frequency in large groups of people. At the same time, radiogenic diseases are indistinguishable from spontaneous ones, which makes it extremely difficult to determine the relationship between the developed disease and exposure. For more than a century of observation, no radiogenic inherited diseases have been proven in humans. Although various genetic effects are observed in radiobiological experiments of animals. Until now, it has not been possible to detect radiogenic cancers at low doses of radiation. It is recognized that modern methods makes it possible to establish the manifestation of radiogenic now, it has been possible to detect radiogenic cancers at low doses of radiation, and it is recognized that modern methods makes it possible to establish the manifestation of radiogenic cancers only for doses of uniform radiation with photons of the whole body or more than 200 million rays per year. Depending on whether a causal relationship can be established between exposure and the occurrence in the exposed population, two subcategories of these effects are distinguished: the category of the registered radiogenic cancers and category of undetectable stochastic radiation effects for radiogenic cancers and genetic effects. Dosimetry should assess the harm of radiation in terms of risk characteristics of the biological effects of radiation. The risk of developing biological effects of radiation is a complex function of radiation dose when considering the entire range of doses encountered in radiation protection practice. For the purposes of radiation protection and safety, deterministic and stochastic effects of radiation are considered, the development of which can lead to premature death or a significant reduction in the period of normal life. The probability of developing stochastic on this slide is blue curve and deterministic effects shown by thin red curve of radiation increases with increasing dose. Dose is probability. This leads to competition between deterministic and stochastic effects of radiation as causes of premature death in exposure people, in exposed people. Take red curve on the slide. At low doses, the probability of premature death is small, and its value is determined by the probability of developing stochastic effects. As the dose increases, the probability of cell death increases faster than the probability of their mutation. So the main effect leading to premature death of people at high doses is a deterministic effect of radiation. The concept of ionizing radiation dose is that the effect of radiation are related to a couple important topics. First of all, is energy absorbed in a unit mass of biological tissue in the form of ionization and excitation of atoms and molecules. And the second topic is related to the quality of radiation, which depends on the microscopic spatial distribution of energy transferred by radiation to matter. The exposure to radiation may also depend on other factors, such as the rate of energy absorption, the degree of oxygen supply to the irradiated tissue, and other factors affecting the radiosensitivity of the irradiated tissue. According to the concept of radiation dose, the effect of irradiation of a human organ or tissue is proportional to the absorbed dose of radiation in this organ and the value that characterizes the quality of the radiation. The value of the average absorbed radiation dose of type R in an organ or tissue, because D is the indices corresponding to T and R, is equal to the ratio of the radiation energy, E with the same indexes T and R, absorbed in the organ or tissue type T, to the mass of this organ or tissue M. Now, the unit of absorbed dose is the the organ or tissue is the same as for previous cases. Weight, which is defined as 1 joule of energy delivered by delivered to 1 kilogram of substance. The value of this average absorbed dose in an organ or tissue is the basis for determining the accurate quantities used in radiation protection and safety. The absorbed dose in an organ or tissue cannot be directly measured. So it is impossible to determine directly how much ionized radiation energy was transferred to a given tissue and what dose was received in any organ or a given subject was irradiated, when a given organ or subject was irradiated. There are many problems that make it impossible to directly measure the dose of an organ. For example, it is impossible to directly place a dosimeter in an organ. It is only possible to measure the physical characteristics of the radiation field and the radiation parameters, such as the radiation fluids, the dose rate behind the absorber layer, or the concentration of radioactive aerosols in the air. Doses to organs and or tissues should be calculated from this data, from past density, from additional information. When calculating the radiation dose for the human body from external and internal radiation sources, information is needed on the anatomical and physiological characteristics of the exposed person, which can be obtained only after a special study of the individual. Such a study and such calculations are performed when planning irradiation in human radiotherapy, for example. When a local tissue area, like tumor, needs to be irradiated with a large dose without affecting the surrounding tissues. Under the condition of protein dosimetric monitoring, this is hardly justified. Therefore, the mass, size, position in the body, and other parameters of organ and tissues of a standard person, so-called, are widely used in radiation dosimetry to assess the dose in the organ. For the purpose of radiation dosimetry, an organ or tissue of a standard person behaves like a cup of tea, and the radiation energy imparted to it behaves like a sugar. Each portion of this sugar dissolves very quickly in the tea after exposure to radiation, and the sugar is uniformly distributed over the cup. The absorbed dose in the organ is the concentration of sugar in this state. Okay. Its sweetness. Sugar cannot escape from the cup, though its walls can. Sugar cannot escape from the cup through the walls and cannot disappear. Therefore, the absorbed dose is a growing function of time. Just as any element of the tea volume in a particular cup has the same concentration of sugar, so the radiation dose of any element of matter within the organ is the same. Very often, different tissues within the same organ have different radiosensitivities. In this case, the organ is considered as a set of individual constituting tissues, and the dose for each of them is determined independently. An example of such a service or service is a model of the respiratory system. In the dosimetric model, the respiratory organs are represented by 2 departments and 5 regions. On this slide. So extrathoracic airways or extrathoracic region within which are allocated area ET1, ET2. ET1 is front of the nose, ET2 is back side of the nasal passage, and the nasal part of the pharynx, the oral part of the pharynx, and the larynx. Patients with medical. And the other group is thoracic. Thoracic region for lungs, within which we are allocating bronchial regions, BB, this one, bronchial, this one, including the airways from the trachea to the main bronchi and bronchi included. The bronchial vulgar region, BB, small one. Which includes the airways from the bronchial walls to the terminal bronchioles included. And the third area is the alveolar interstitial region, AI. Which includes the airways from respiratory bronchioles and bronchioles to the alveolar sacs and alveoli included. And the interstitial or connective tissues in them. This dosimetric model of the human respiratory system was proposed by ICRP, again, the National Committee of Radiation Protection, in publication number 66 in 1994. The concept of a standard person occupies an extremely important place in modern radiation safety. First was United States Federal Radiation Safety legislation, who defines a standard human as a hypothetical aggregate of human physical and physiological characteristics, including from an international agreement referring to ICRP publication number 43. These characteristics can be used to standardize the results of biological experiments and compare biological damage with the normal state, as well as the standardized the calculations of radiation dose. The introduction of the concept of standard person pursues the goal of unambiguously defining the conditions for evaluating the metric quantities that characterize the conditions of exposure. The parameters of standard people, all age groups, were determined: newborns, 1-year-old infants, 5, 10, 15 years old children, and adolescents, as well as adult people from the population, and separately workers who deals with resources. Parameters reflecting the quality of radiation characterize the radiosensitivity of a standard person. There are 3 quantitative characteristics of radiation quality used in radiological protection. First is coefficient of relative biological efficiency of radiation, or RBE. Second is weighting coefficient of radiation, WR. And radiation quality factor Q. This is R, depending on the type of radiation. The first one, RVE, is used to evaluate the quality of radiation in relation to the development of a single deterministic effect. It characterizes the radiation incident on the body or in the case of individual radiation sources, the radiation emitted by the source. The value of RVE depends on the organ and tissue. That means we have coefficients here, tissue and radiation. For the second one, WR, is used to evaluate the quality of radiation in relation to the development of any stochastic effects. It characterizes the radiation incident on the body, or in the case of internal radiation sources, the radiation emitted by the source from inside. And relative to the third one, coefficient, the main idea is the main area of application of this radiation quality factor is the monitoring of external radiation fields. Therefore, it is defined as a function of the measured radiation quality factor. It's LET. The aim of radiation protection, but repeat, is to prevent the occurrence of deterministic effects in individuals by monitoring doses below an appropriate threshold, and to ensure that all reasonable measures are taken to reduce the occurrence of stochastic effects in the population now and in the future. To achieve this goal, it is necessary to evaluate the exposure conditions in terms of dosimetric quantities that could be used to assess the risk of developing deterministic effects and radiogenic cancers. In this section, two dosimetric quantities will be considered. The RBE weighted dose intended to characterize exposure in assessing the probability of development of deterministic effects of radiation, and also equivalent dose intended to characterize exposure in assessing the likelihood of developing stochastic effects of radiation. Doing this, a lot of materials will help us. Deterministic effects of radiation occur when exposed to high doses. The scientific basis for assessing the risk of developing these effects is the result of studying the consequences of accidental exposure of people. The deterministic effects are acute and chronic radiation sickness, local designs of organs or tissues, for example, radiation burns, and also radiation cataracts related to the legs of the eye. Also, final anomalies and tangential malfunctions of newborns, which are deterministic effects of the radiation of the fetus in the embryonic period. Assistance to International Atomic Energy Agency member states in responding to accidents and analyzing the consequences of accidental exposure are important function of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Accident lessons are analyzed in agency publications. They form the basis for the requirements and guidelines for the protection of people in radiation accidents. The slide shows some International Atomic Energy Agency's publications containing the analysis of some accidents related to Chernobyl, Fukushima, etc. The main patterns of development of severe deterministic effects of irradiation are as follows. Due to the variability of individual radiosensitivity of people, any effect is characterized by a range of threshold doses for the appearance of the effect. Different tissues of even the one organ differ in radiosensitivity. Therefore, with an increase in the radiation dose, the biological effect may change. The occurrence of which ultimately leads to serious illness or death. With an increase in the radiation dose, the severity of the effect increases, which is reflected by the reduction in survival time, which is the time interval between exposure and death. And next topic, with increase in dose rate and an increase in the duration of the irradiation time, the risk of developing a deterministic effect decreases due to the restoration of the function of the affected organ. Start working repair systems. To assess risk of developing deterministic effects, there is not enough information on the accumulated dose. If the duration of exposure exceeds several hours, then in order to correctly assess the risk, it is necessary to know the genetic history of the exposure, which describes the change in the dose rate over time, as shown in the next slide. Here we see P, T, and R. It's a probability or risk of developing a severe effect. Coefficient B. This function of death intensity. In case of developing a severe deterministic effect, when an organ type T is irradiated with radiation of type R during a period of time from 0 to delta. Then D is dot. It's the function of change in time of the absorbed dose rate of radiation of type R again in order type T during the considered period of time. And the last of this RBE at the start, the coefficient of the relative biological effectiveness of radiation of the type R during irradiation of the organ type T. Cosmetic characteristics of radiation, like the absorbed radiation dose of the organ and the coefficient of relative biological effectiveness RBE, are presented in the formula shown in the slide in the form of a product, which is called the RBE weighted organ or tissue irradiation dose. RBE weighted dose is designed to assess the risk of developing deterministic effects of radiation, taking into account the influence of the radiation quality and radiosensitivity of the irradiated organ on the process. This value is equal to the product of the absorbed dose of R-type radiation in the organ or tissue T, D, by the coefficient of reliable biological effectiveness, RBE is index T and R. The unit of measure for the RBE weighted dose is joule per kilogram, which is the same like previous time, but very equivalent. The metric value called RBE weighted dose was defined by the International Atomic Energy Agency, not by ICRP. In 2004, when working with guidelines for responding to radiation accidents, when the risk of deterministic effects due to accidental exposure to high doses must be taken into account. The table of the slide shows, as an example, the recommended values of RBE for the development of the severe deterministic effects during external photon and neutron irradiation and internal irradiation of the alveolar section of the respiratory organs of a standard person. The area of the respiratory organs where gas exchange occurs between blood and inhaled air. The consequence of such exposure at high doses is the development of radiation pneumonia. The table also shows the recommended values of RBE for the development of severe deterministic effects during external irradiation of the small intestines and internal irradiation of the large intestine of a standard person. The consequence of such exposure and at high doses is the development of intestinal syndrome, self-absorption of alpha radiation in the content of intensive intestine during the passage of radioactive substance through the gastrointestinal tract leads to the impossibility of developing an interstitial syndrome, which reflects zero value established for this case. To evaluate the deterministic effects of radiation that develop as a result of the radiation of organs, RBE is used. The weighted absorbed dose, or we call it RBE dash weighted dose in an organ or tissue. So RBE weighted dose is intended to explain differences in biological effectiveness in production deterministic effects of radiation in organs or tissues of a standard person due to the differences in radiation quality. In the case of external exposure of a person in fields of indirect ionizing radiation, it is assumed that the exposure of individual organs and tissues characterizes the average absorbed dose. In this case, the RBE depends only on the properties of the radiation and the possible influence on the influence of the inhomogeneity of the spatial dose distribution is neglected. In the case of internal irradiation, the inhomogeneity of the dose distribution in an organ or tissue can play a significant role in the development of deterministic effects. And radionuclides that emit low-range particles, alpha particles, and low-energy beta particles enter the body. In this case, the use of average absorbed dose as a characteristics of radiation is manifested in the fact that RBE visitors becomes dependent not only on the properties of the radiation, but also on the properties of the irradiated organ. The correspondence of this phenomenon is a difference. The consequence of this phenomenon is the different colors of the cups, representing the dependence of RBE on the properties of the radiation and the properties of the irradiated organ. So these cups have each organ is own. most important data on the carcinogenic effects of ionizing radiation were obtained after the Second World War when monitoring the health status of the inhabitants of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who survived after the atomic bombing of these cities in 1945 by Americans. Already in 1947, the Commission on Accounting for Research the consequences of the atomic bombing began work in Japan, organized by the National Academy of Sciences and with help of US Atomic Energy Commission. Upon completion of the main stage of research in 1975, the Japanese and the US governments established the Radiation Effects Research Foundation to replace the commission. At present, this fund contains all the information on radiation doses and the state of health of witnesses of the atomic bombing and their descendants. In 1950s, the national census was conducted in Japan. According to the census, 280,000 people were assigned to be the category of person exposed as a result of the atomic bombing. To study the long-term effects of the atomic bombing, cohorts of a total number of approximately 200,000 people were selected from them. The purpose of the epidemiological epidemiological surveillance of these cohorts was to study the long-term effects of ionizing radiation, including radiogenic cancers. The number of cohorts studied varied over time due to the deaths of witnesses to the bombing and the birth of their descendants. At the current level of development in radiobiology, it is possible to reveal an additional number of radiogenic cancers in an irradiated population only with the help of the radiation epidemiological study. The study and the result of such a study is a conclusion or a statistical conclusion about the reliability of the existence in the irradiated group of people of a certain number of cancer patients with a disease caused by radiation. The reliability of detecting additional radiogenic cancers depends on the radiation dose, the number of people in the control group and the observation group, and also on properties of the population, the frequency of spontaneous cancers, temporal variations in this value, the level of exposure to other carcinogenic factors, etc. Immunological risk assessment models, which describe the occurrence of radiogenic cancers using a generalized relative risk model, are most widely used among radiation safety specialists. According to this model, the frequency of occurrence of radiogenic cancers in an irradiated cohort is directly proportional to the frequency of occurrence of the same cancers in the non-irradiated population, from which the cohort was composed. Years of latent development of radiogenic cancer can pass between exposure and diagnosis of the disease. The risk of developing this radiation effect is determined as the probability of frequency of a certain type of cancer in the person who takes type S for T years after a single radiation of this organ T and at age G. The slide shows the general form of the dependence of the risk. The development stochastic effects during irradiation. The time factor plays a very important role in the development of radiogenic cancer. For example, the presence of a latent period for cancer development makes it almost impossible that radiogenic cancer will be diagnosed during a period of time after exposure that will be noticeably shorter than the duration of the later period. In case of long-term exposure, which lasts for years, for example, as a result of living in a contaminated area, or due to the intake of a radioactive substance, the cumulative exposure dose alone is not enough to assess the risk. It is necessary to know the dosimetric history of exposure on an annual scale, since the probability of developing an effect due to the multiple exposures is determined by the sum of the probabilities of developing effects associated with individual episodes of a person's dosimetric history. Dosimetric characteristics of irradiation, so dose or irradiation of an organ and coefficient of relative biological effectiveness are present in the formula, are presented in the formula as a product when determining the RBE, the weighted dose, for assessing the risk of developing deterministic effects. In the case of the development of stochastic effects, the relative biological efficiency of radiation weakly depends on the properties of the irradiated organ. Therefore, instead of RBE coefficient, the corresponding weighting coefficient of radiation W with index R is used to characterize these effects. The product of the absorption dose in an organ or tissue and the weighting factor for a given type of radiation is called the equivalent dose. The equivalent dose is intended to assess the risk of developing stochastic effects of radiation, taking into account the influence of radiation volume. If the units for this dose equivalent is a joule per kilogram, and in this case it will be called not greater than 0. The metric quantity called equivalent dose was defined by the ICRP in the 1990s recommendations. The table on the slide shows values of the WR coefficient for the development of any stochastic effects during external and internal irradiation of any organ or tissue of a standard person. The weighting factor for radiation is used in determining the equivalent dose. The weighting coefficient may be different for different radiation energies of the same type, but the value doesn't depend on the organ or tissue being irradiated. The weighting factors refer to external radiation incident on the surface of the body, and in the case of internal radiation emitted during nuclear transformation. The values of radiation weighting coefficients were established based on the generalization of the RBE radiation coefficients for the development of radiogenic cancers of various localizations in humans and other mammals, as well as for the medical information of mammalian cells in vitro. Following the logic of determining the RBE coefficient, the weighting radiation factor WR can be conditionally considered equal to the ratio of the absorbed dose of X-ray or X-ray radiation to the absorbed dose of the type R, at which the probabilities of any stochastic effect occurring with irradiating a standard person are equal. For X-ray and gamma radiation, coefficients WR are equal to 1. For all other ionizing radiation, these coefficients greater or equal to 1. And is established on the basis of the RBE generalization for radiation of organs and tissues in various types of radiation. Unlike the values of RBE coefficients determined for specific exposure conditions, the values of radiation weighted factors do not correlate with any particular effect of radiation in humans. They characterize the development of any stochastic effects. The value of WR characterizes the probability of some conditional stochastic effect occurring when a standard person is exposed to radiation of various nature under conditions of chronic exposure in the low dose region. The consequence of this phenomenon is the same color of different cups, representing the correspondence of coefficient WR only on the properties of the radiation. Come to the quantities for determining the requirements for the state radiation safety. So in this section, we will consider the symmetric value, the effective dose, which is used to characterize the conditions of exposure under which the objectives of ensuring radiation safety can be considered achieved. The limited quantity used for the numerical expression of the radiation safety ensure that the symmetric quantity used for the numerical expression of the radiation safety assurance criterion must satisfy a number of specific requirements and be a universal characteristic of human exposure suitable for use in the practical adherence to the principles of radiation safety. An additive function of the radiation dose, so that in practice simple monitoring can be organized to evaluate it. Also, it should be applicable to the risk assessment for a wide range of radiogenic cancers and genetic effects of the radiation. And ultimately, it should be applicable to assess risk deriving from a wide range of exposure conditions. So the ICRP was proposed to use the effective equivalent dose or effective dose for short as such value. Initially, the effective dose was defined by the ICRP in the 1990s recommendations as a function designed to be all possible causes of spatial inhomogeneous exposure, which is organs of the body to a standard person, to a uniform exposure of the entire body of such a standard person. As as the estimated effect of radiation, a reduction in the duration of normal life as a result of the development of severe stochastic effects of radiation was taken. The result of such an event is the infliction of damage to the risk person equal to the loss of 15 years of fruitful life. The effective dose in is defined as a function equal to the sum of the products of the equivalent doses H and coefficients. Coefficients WT corresponding to these organs and tissues. This slide table shows the values of gating factors for tissues and organs in calculating the effective dose, established again by the ICRP. And in the recommendations from 2007, the ICRP changed the definition of effective dose, which in radiation protection plays the role of the function depending on the doses with individual organs. First of all, the risk of mean and additional organs, the exposure of which should be taken into account when calculating the effective dose were expanded. The issue weighting coefficients changed accordingly, and on top of the rule for according exposure to other organs will be changed. These changes will not affect the assessment of external exposure in terms of normalized values, but may significantly affect the estimated or the expected effective doses of internal exposure from the intake of organotropic radionuclides. Special volumetric value intended in the field of exposure of both doses to assess the effectiveness of radiological protection is the collective effective dose S, which for a team of n people is equal to the sum of the individual effective doses of exposure of members of the teams. E1, E2, up to the En. The unit of collective effective dose is men/Ziegler, men multiplied by Ziegler. Generally, the collective dose is related to a specific practice and the period of time during which that activity results in exposure of a specific group of people. The value of the collective effective dose is used in optimizing the radiological protection of personnel through cost-benefit analysis. Within the framework of this approach, the collective dose unit is assigned the value of the certain damage in terms of the loss of normal life expectancy, or the monetary equivalent of collective dose unit output. The product of the effective dose by the factor gives the value of the monetary equivalent of the exposure of a group of a person performing any work, and this value is already considered in the framework of the cost-benefit analysis. The monetary equipment, the monetary equivalent of a unit of collective dose is a guideline value determined by the radiation safety regulator for the purpose of ensuring radiation safety for use by all operating companies. Within the country, also, it is not uncommon for these companies to establish their own rules for determining the monetary equivalent. radiological damage. Monetary equivalent is mainly used to justify important decisions like reconstruction, installations, expensive repair and restoration works, etc. The practical implementation of such value leads to a change in radiation doses and the number of exposed persons. Effective dose satisfies all the requirements for the dosimetric value intended for the numerical expression of the radiation safety assurance criteria. Just by step by step. Being a universal characteristic of irradiation, it is suitable for assessing the consequences of radiation during internal, general, external, and local irradiation of human body. On the other hand, this value is designed to assess the probability of causing harm to an irradiated person, the amount of which can be expressed in monetary terms. Also, it is an additive function of the radiation dose. And at the end, when determining the effective dose, exposure to all major human organs is taken into account, which determines its radiosensitivity in the organ with low doses. The effective dose is intended to express the value of the dose limit and the characteristics of the human exposure dose in order to demonstrate compliance with safety standards. The introduction of this value into practice gave rise to a huge amount of data in the dosimetric monitoring, and the illusion that using this value it is possible to determine the individual radiogenic risk in the sense of the probability of premature death caused by exposure. At present, having reviewed the practice of using effective dose in radiation safety, the committee of ICRP recommends that this value no longer be used to assess the medical consequences of exposure. According to the latest ICRP recommendations, which are presented in published at the 2007 recommendations, the use of an effective dose for assessing the medical consequences of exposure is unacceptable. According to the recommendations for radiogenic risk assessment, equivalent dose in organs and tissues should be used. And the effective dose should serve solely for the purpose of regulating exposure and demonstrating compliance with those limits for the levels in the field of radiation safety. Basic for demonstrating the compliance of the conditions for the use of radiation sources with the requirements for ensuring radiation safety. The determination of the individual dose of a person accumulated during the monitoring period, regulated by the standards for the duration. This section will discuss the dosimetric quantities used to demonstrate compliance with radiation safety requirements, such as ambient dose equivalent for monitoring the radiation field in order to evaluate the effective dose or other values of radiological protection. Secondly, the individual dose equivalent for monitoring external exposure of a person in order to evaluate the effective dose or other values of radiological protection. And ultimately, permitted effective dose of internal exposure for estimating the effective dose from internal exposure. Radiation protection, when determining the normalized values, and the values for their limits. The individual radiosensitivity of a particular person is fundamentally not taken into account. As shown above, the values of the main parameters that are used in determining the equivalent and effective doses are a generalization of a large area of data obtained in the study of the biological effects of radiation in experiments when various biological objects were investigated. All of them are monitoring more than characteristics of a standard person in the broad sense of the term. Thus, the basis for assessing the individual dose of a person is the characteristics inherent in a conventional standard person, radiation quality indicators, parameters like size, shape, weight, relative position in the body of radiosensitive organs and tissues. And then tissue weighting factors needed to calculate effective dose, etc. In the case of occupational exposure, the individual exposure dose of a worker is assumed to be equal to the exposure dose of a standard person who will be in the same production conditions and perform the same work with the source of as this individual. The value of the individual dose is attributed to the individual based on the results of monitoring external and internal exposure. When determining the individual dose of a worker, it differs from the true radiation dose of the individual, which we call a personal dose, due to the difference between the characteristics of a standard person and the personal characteristics of the individual is ignored. Main task of demonstrating the compliance of the conditions for the use of radiation sources with the requirements for ensuring radiation safety is to determine the values of the individual external exposure dose equivalent for the monitoring period and amount of radioactive substance intake. In the case of annual monitoring period, the value of the annual effective dose compared with the dose limit. The unit of annual effective dose is sievert per year. Here it is. Okay. And on the slide, E is the annual effective dose, sievert per year. H within this P from 10. Individual external dose equivalent per year, in sieverts per year, and then I is different coefficients in means oral intake of radionuclide into the body per year, in becquerels per year, and I within this inhalation intake of radionuclide into the body per year, again in becquerels per year, and coefficient E also with index in and in corresponding those coefficients equal to the permitted effective dose for inhaled intake of 1 becquerels of radionuclide into the body, 0 per becquerel. Normalized values, equivalent and effective doses, cannot be directly measured. They can be calculated from measurements of basic dosimetric quantities, characterizing the radiation field, or estimated from measurements of operational the symmetric quantities, characterizing the radiation field and its interaction with the human body. So external exposure monitoring uses dose equivalent as a main quantity for evaluating other radiation monitoring quantities. Ambient dose equivalent for monitoring the radiation field in order to evaluate the effective dose for other radiological protection quantities. And also individual dose equivalent for monitoring external human exposure for the purpose of evaluating effective dose for other radiological quantities. Radiation falling into the human body transfers its energy to biological tissue and causes biological effects of radiation. The irradiated human body distorts the field of ionizing radiation. Primary and distributed distort radiation fields have different dosimetric properties and should be characterized by different dosimetric values. So we apply point dosimetric quantities for the dose and its Kerman, air Kerman, characterize the undisturbed radiation field, and also use operational dosimetric quantities like ambient dose equivalent and individual dose equivalent. They are characterize the distributed radiation field affecting the human body. And also we use tissue dosimetric quantities. Absorb dose in an organ or tissue, also RBE weighted dose, etc. They are characterizing the energy of a disturbed radiation field compared to the organ or tissue of the human body. So in this slide, blue arrows is neutrons, are neutrons, and red waves photons. Rational values and equidosimetric values uniquely determined through the physical characteristics of the radiation field at a point, as close as possible to the normalized value under standard irradiation conditions, and intended for a conservative assessment of the value during dosimetric control. The introduction of operational quantities into the practice of radiation monitoring is necessary, first of all, to unify the methods of monitoring and determine the quantities for the response functions of radiation monitoring devices. The individual dose equivalent H within its speed dependence of D is equal to the dose equivalent in soft biological tissue at a depth of D millimeters. Couple times on this slide. Below the considered point on the surface of a wet phantom or on the body of the adult. The use of a phantom or a human body in this case makes it possible to directly take into account the perturbation of this real radiation field by a person. The ambient dose equivalent or equivalent dose H within this star just the minutes, also the independence of D, was taken as an operational value of external exposure to control the radiation situation. The ambient dose equivalent is used to parameterize the radiation field at a point coinciding with the center of the ICRU spherical phantom, a sphere made of 30 centimeter diameter tissue equivalent material. Usually it's polyethylene or other hydrogen containing medium. And material for material made with density around 1 gram per centimeter cubic. The result of monitoring this, the radiation are used to calculate the dose of external exposure. Parameter D determines the ratio of the operating and normalized values. At D equals to 10 millimeters, values H with a star of 10 and H with P 10 correspond to the effective dose of external radiation. At D equals to 3 millimeters, these two values, H with star, H with P indices, correspond to the equivalent dose of external radiation for the length of the eye. And ultimately, at D equals to 7 hundredths or 0.07 millimeter, these two values, H with star and H with index P, correspond to the equivalent dose of external skin irradiation. To determine the operational quantities for external exposure, a dose equivalent H is used, which is equal to the absorbed dose at the point D, multiplied by the average quality factor for radiation Q. Q is in this R is the same as D. Acting on tissue at that point, the dose equivalent unit is joules per kilogram, which is called here again Ziegler. Radiation quality factor is used to evaluate operational quantities in radiation monitoring. The quality factor has a functional dependence on the linear energy transfer in water. The numerical ratio between Q of L and L was defined by the ICRP in the 1990 recommendations and is shown in this table. As shown earlier, in order to demonstrate compliance with the requirements for ensuring radiation safety, in the case of internal exposure during individual dosimetric monitoring, the value of the effective dose of internal exposure is taken to be the value of the permitted effective dose due to the intake of radionuclides into the body for a certain period of time and equal to the product of the intake of the radionuclide over the specified monitoring period. On the dose factor of the committed effective dose. The dose coefficient is equal to the expected effective dose of internal exposure due to the intake of 1 becquerel of radionuclide through inhalation or ingestion. The values of the dose coefficients are tabulated in the annexes to, for example, Russian standard NRB 99-2006. For a certain radionuclide and road of entry, the dose coefficients are determined as a product of the time integrals of the rates of equivalent doses of irradiation of organs and WT for an intake of 1 becquerel of radionuclide. And the formula is entered on the slide. 0 is the moment of intake, and H is dot. And the equivalent dose rate in the organ or tissue type T at time T. Type T is capital and T is small letter, means time after the intake of 1 becquerel of the radionuclide. For the purposes of radiation safety, it is assumed that tau equals to 50 years for those who are 20 years old, and tau equals to 70 minus G, where G is age. It's for people under 20 years of age. So in general, the relationship between the quantities used in radio radiation protection and safety is represented on this slide. So, red indicates red circles, ovals, indicates the internal radiometric quantities, the bands of external radiation and activity of the human body in the human body. Green color indicates basic dosimetric quantities. Absorb those at a point and determine the area. Blue color indicates the values for estimating the probability of developing of radiation effects. Yellow color indicates the quantities that determining the requirements for the state of radiation safety, like effective dose. Purple indicates values to demonstrate compliance of the state of regulation safety with regulatory requirements. And white color is probably not white, indicates basic equidosimetric values. Wait. Yellow. And all that material. Human exposure can be represented by the values of any dosimetric quantities given in this lecture. Meanwhile, the areas of exposure conditions within which these dosimetric quantities can act as exposure characteristics important for human protection purposes, they are limited. As an example, consider the consequences of external exposure to photons. With external irradiation of the whole body with photons with a dose of less than 1 gray, radiogenic cancers are the main cause of premature death. And with irradiation with a dose of more than 4 grays, deterministic radiation effects. When irradiating the whole body with a dose of 1 to 4 grays, premature death can be associated with the development of both deterministic and stochastic effects of radiation. A causal relationship between cancer death and exposure cannot be established in the whole body if the whole body dose not exceed 0.1 gray. The slide shows the areas of doses of external exposure to photons where it is advisable to use certain dosimetric values to assess the consequences of a radiation accident. The contribution of the risk of developing stochastic effects to the overall probability of premature death is negligible at doses over 4 grays. So an RBE weighted dose should be used to estimate the effect of exposure in this area. The contribution of stochastic effects to total mortality cannot be detected at doses below 0.1 gray. So the effective dose should be used to assess the possible consequences of exposure in this area. Next step, the contribution of the risk of developing deterministic effects to the overall probability of premature death is negligible at doses below 1 gray. So equivalent doses should be used to estimate the effects of exposure in the range of from 0.1 up to 1 grade. And ultimately, the contribution of the risk of developing stochastic and deterministic effects to the total probability of premature death is comparable at doses from 1 to 4 days. So both RBE weighted and equivalent doses should be used to assess the effect of exposure in this area. That's all for now. Any more questions? All of it before tests. Okay. Thank you very much.
Questions and students. I think we have a question in chat.
Okay.